Here's the thing about painting skin. You might be making very simple mistakes that are ruining your painting. So although there are so many different skin tones, today we'll just take a look at 3 examples, one fair and one tan and one darker skin tone, and see how these principles apply and how can we actually paint these different skin tones effectively. So let's just start with the lighter and the fairer skin tones. The main base color can be lighter and closer to the orange rather than the red or the yellow. And then make sure the saturation is a bit lower so that the skin doesn't look too fake. So as you can see, this is the color that I chose. And then the most common mistake is that when people want to start painting shadows, they just make the color darker. And that doesn't really work. So something that we need to know about is skin actually has a lot of color variation, and it's not just one color. So if we look at skin, you'll see that it reflects a lot of different colors, and that's why it looks so alive and real. So when we're trying to add shadows, it's good to increase the saturation a little bit and then also go darker. And then also move the hue a little bit towards the red, just a tiny bit. This way you get a little bit of that color variations, and the colors don't all look the same, and the skin color looks a little bit more alive and vibrant. Something that you may have seen and I wanted to just touch on is that the head has 3 different color zones, where the top of the head is more yellowish so it goes more towards the yellow, the middle of the face is more towards the red, and then the bottom of the face is cooler and less saturated at the bottom because it gets a lot of those shadow shapes and not too much of the light. So when painting, always keep that in mind, that you should have those color zones in there so that you can also add more color variation that way. And as you can see, when I'm picking the shadow color, I go more towards the red and more saturated. And then when I'm doing the lights, I go more towards the yellow and I reduce the saturation a little bit as well. Also, when adding the light and shadow, you should always remember the different planes of the face. And as you can see here, this is just an example of the Asaro head where it shows the different planes of the face. So when you're doing your light and shadow, consider those planes so that you can know and predict where the light and shadow pieces will be, and your face will look more real, and the shape of the face will be more believable, and then you're not having these random shadow shapes and random light shapes in all over the place. So you consider where the light hits and where the shadow is when looking at the face compared to the Asaro head. You can always have that next to you as a reference so that when you're trying to do the light and shadows, you really know where those things go. And as I've said this before, always try and work with big brush strokes first and think about the big light and shadow shapes first before you go into detail. So as you can see, I use the big round brush to just add the big shadow and light shapes. And then the lighting scenario is very simple here so that we can really focus on the skin tones rather than complex light and shadow features of the painting. Once I had the main light and shadow shapes done, I went in and started adding more details in the smaller parts like the eyes, the eyebrows, and also the lips. And then one of the things about the lips is that the upper lip is usually facing down and the bottom lip is facing up. So when you're doing your light and shadow shapes, keep that in mind. So in this case, the upper lip is more in shadow and the bottom lip is more in light. So the top lip should be darker than the bottom lip. And you can also add some highlights to the bottom lip to show that even more. So now that we have the main things done, you can just spend more time rendering more and more and more until you get your painting to the point that you're happy with it. And you can also go back and really think about those zones again. The middle zone where it's more red, the top zone more yellow, and the bottom zone more desaturated and gray. And you can go in and add that if you want. It's good to have that at the beginning before you get too much into details. But if you're done your painting and you think the colors are not exactly right yet and it feels very monotone, so you can go in and add those colors back in if you like. So now let's move on to another skin tone, a little bit darker, maybe a tan skin tone. So the idea here is to go a little bit darker, of course, but also move a little bit towards the red. So in all of these scenarios, we're assuming the lighting is the same so that the different skin tones can really be seen, and we're not really playing a lot with the light. So as I mentioned, you start with a little bit, you go a little bit towards the red, although it might look unnatural at first, but once we start adding the light and shadow, it will look a little bit better. So similar to before, when we want to add the shadows, we go a little bit more saturated and darker and increase the saturation. So always keep in mind when we're doing shadow shapes, we go darker in value, more saturated, and move it more towards the red. And then when we're trying to do the lights in the spots that they get more light, for example, the cheeks or the front of the cheeks or the forehead or the nose, or really the spots that really gets the light, we go a little bit more towards the yellow, and then we go lighter, of course, and a bit less saturated. But always try and remember the color mapping of the face. So go back in and make sure that you have a little bit more red around the cheeks in the center of the face and a little bit more yellow at the top. And if you do that at the beginning, once you start rendering, you have a little bit of a better time trying to render, and you don't have to go back and try and add those color variations in afterwards. So then we really just follow the same steps. We just follow the same steps as before. Just think about the planes, just like we said before, look at the Asaro head. But these initial colors that we chose really help demonstrate that different skin tone. So a little bit more towards the red. So the darker the skin goes, the more we move towards the red. A common mistake is to try and use the same hue or the same color and just as the fair skin tone and just increase the value and make it darker. And if you do that, the skin really looks, or the person really looks almost like they're sick, and it looks very yellowish and brown rather than the natural skin tone of a darker person or a tan person. And when we talk about the bottom of the face being a little bit cooler and more grayish, it's really relative to the rest of the face. So it doesn't mean that we should go towards completely blue and add blue, although in some cases that might work. But the idea is that it's relative to the rest of the face. And as we can see here, even though the bottom of the face is still in the warmer colors, relative to the rest of the face, it is much closer to the gray. And similarly the forehead, even though the forehead is still around the orange or the red, relative to the rest of the face, it's more closer to the yellow. So similar to before, once we have the main shadow and light shapes done using these colors and using these color variations, we go in and add more details in there, adding details of the lips and the eyes and the eyebrows and the hair, and then we can start rendering more and more. And again, you can go back and add a little bit more of that colors that we want. For example, make the cheeks a little bit more red, or maybe even add some more details in the face. So at this point, now that we have two of the drawings done and complete, we can look at the difference between the two. We can choose two different colors of the face on the same spots and see what the differences are. So as you can see, once we put them next to each other, you can see how the darker skin tone moves more towards the red and gets more saturation. So this is how we get the darker skin tone. So now we can move to the third example, and this is the dark skin tone. So we started with the fair and then the tan, and now we'll go to the really dark skin tone. So this time we go really towards the red, and sometimes you can even go towards the cooler reds and add that as your base. It might look unnatural at first, but as you start adding the light and shadow, you'll see how these colors actually really work. But the same principles apply. Once we want to add shadow and light shapes, we go more towards the red, so we make it even cooler. So let's say if we're in the warm red, we go towards the cool red to add the shadow shades. So of course we make it more saturated and darker. And then when we want to do the light, we can move more towards the yellow and add the light that way. And then we keep in mind the same concepts, that the cheeks should be more red, so make sure you add a little bit more saturation there to give that color zone of the face. And then another thing that I find very interesting when it comes to darker skin tones is that they really reflect the environment or the light more, and you see that light reflection into the skin. And painting it that way really helps make the painting a lot nicer when you see those reflections. You can put that on all skin tones, of course, but when it comes to darker skin tones, as you can see in these examples of these portraits photographs, you can see a lot of that reflection a lot more in the skin. So I like to add that in there, and usually it's a reflection of the light or the environment. So you can think about what is your environment or what is the light source that is on the face, and you can add those really highlights onto the face. One of the nice things that you can do, and I did here, was that I added that light reflection on a separate layer. And when I did that, I was able to play around with the colors and see if I wanted, for example, make it a cooler or a warmer color. One other thing that I didn't talk about much, and this applies for all skin tones, is the subsurface scattering. And subsurface scattering is when actually the light can go through the skin a little bit. And a good example of seeing it is really in the ears. If you look at photos of the ears, for example, when the light is really bright, you can see that the light almost passes through the ears, for example. You can also see it in many different places. For example, if you just hold your hand in front of the sun, you can really see that around your fingers. So you can go in and add that extra bright red light onto the ears, for example, to show that the skin is alive and it's really translucent, and the light can go through it a little bit. And those little details of things that we talked about, of the colors of the cheek and the different skin tones and the different color variations and light going through the ears or the skin in some areas, really makes the painting look alive, and it doesn't look like it's a statue. So make sure when you're painting, you add those color variations. If you just use one color and you just increase the value and decrease the value to just make light and shadow shapes, you'll get a really dull painting, and it looks pretty much like it's dead. So always remember to think about the light source, where it's coming from and where it's going, and how it would reflect on the face. And then think about the different color zones of the face to make sure you add that color variation in there. So now that we have all the paintings done, one more thing that you can do to make your painting look a little bit more interesting and exciting is to add a little bit of a texture into some parts. And usually what I like to do is into the highlights. So you can just, for example, pick a textured brush and then go in specific areas where you think there might be some highlights and just add that texture in there, and it makes the painting look a little bit more interesting and exciting. And you can do that on all skin tones, as you can see here. And if you see that the texture is too much, maybe you can pick the smudge tool and just smudge it so that the texture, it doesn't stand out so much. So there we go. This was just 3 skin tones that we painted together. If you want to know exactly how to draw before you can start painting, you can watch this video here where I go through the steps of drawing the portrait. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.